Chapter 1: The Big Cycles in a Tiny Nutshell. As explained in the introduction, the world order is now rapidly shifting in important ways that have never happened in our lifetimes but have happened many times before in history. My objective is to show you those cases and the mechanics that drove them and, with that perspective, attempt to imagine the future. The countries shown in this study had the most wealth and power. This is a study of how wealth and power have come and gone in the leading powers of the world. To be clear, while the leading powers covered in this study were the richest and most powerful, they weren't necessarily the best off countries for two reasons. First, while wealth and power are what most people want and will fight over most, some people and their countries don't think that these things are the most important and wouldn't think of fighting over them. Second, this group of countries excludes what I will call the boutique countries, like Switzerland and Singapore, that score very high in wealth and living standards but aren't large enough to become one of the biggest empires. Throughout history, wealth was gained by either making it, taking it from others, or finding it in the ground. Let's start with the big picture basics. Throughout recorded history, various forms of groups of people, example tribes, kingdoms, countries, have gained wealth and power by building it themselves, taking it from others, or finding it in the ground. Human productivity is the most important force in causing the world's total wealth, power, and living standards to rise over time. Productivity, i.e., the output per person, driven by learning, building, and inventiveness, has steadily improved over time because learning is gained more than lost. Most everything evolves in an uptrend with cycles around it. I.e., estimated real GDP per person over the last 500 years. As shown from this top-down, big picture perspective, output per person appears to be steadily improving, though very slowly in the early years and faster after around 1800, when the slope up becomes much steeper, reflecting the faster productivity gains. That broader-based learning also shifted wealth and power away from an agriculture-based economy in which land ownership was the principal source of power, and the monarchies, nobles, and church worked together to maintain their grip on it, toward an industrial-based economy in which inventive capitalists created and owned the means of production of industrial goods and worked together with those in government to maintain the system that allowed them to have the wealth and power. The shifts in wealth and power that occurred between countries. China was dominant for centuries, consistently outcompeting Europe in goods trade, though it entered a steep decline starting in the 1800s. The Netherlands, a relatively small country, became one of the world's great empires in the 1600s. The UK followed a very similar path, peaking in the 1800s. Finally, the US rose to become the world's superpower over the last 150 years, though particularly during and after World War II, and is now in relative decline while China is catching up once again. These indices were made up of a number of different statistics, some of which were directly comparable and some of which were broadly analogous or broadly indicative. In some cases, a data series that stopped at a certain point had to be spliced with a series that continued back in time. Our measures of wealth and power. The single measure of wealth and power that I showed you for each country in the prior charts is made up as a roughly equal average of 8 measures of strength. They are 1. Education, 2. Competitiveness, 3. Technology, 4. Economic output, 5. Share of world trade, 6. Military strength, 7. Financial center strength, and 8. Reserve currency. The big cycle. Broadly speaking, we can look at these rises and declines as happening in 3 phases. The ascent phase, which is characterized by the gaining of competitive advantages. The top phase, which is characterized by sustaining the strength but eventually sowing the seeds for the loss of the competitive advantages that were behind the ascent, and the decline phase, which is characterized by self-reinforcing declines in all of these strengths. The ascent phase. Strong enough and capable enough leadership. Strong education, strong character, civility, and a strong work ethic. Low corruption and high respect for rules, such as rule of law. People being able to work well together, united behind a common view of how they should be together and a common purpose. A good system for allocating resources. Being open to the best global thinking. Greater competitiveness in the global market. Strong income growth. Increased investments to improve their infrastructures, education systems, and research and development. Higher productivity. New technologies. A significant share of world trade. A strong military. Financial centers. Strong equity, currency, and credit markets. The top phase. Prosperous periods lead to people earning more, which naturally leads them to become more expensive, which naturally makes them less competitive relative to those in countries where people are willing to work for less. Those who are most successful typically have their ways of being more successful copied by emerging competitors, which also contributes to the leading power becoming less competitive. Those who become richer naturally tend to work less hard, engage in more leisurely and less productive activities, and at the extreme, become decadent and unproductive. The currencies of countries that are richest and most powerful become the world's reserve currencies, which gives them the exorbitant privilege of being able to borrow more money, which gets them deeper into debt. The leading country extends the empire to the point that the empire has become uneconomical to support and defend. Economic success naturally leads to larger wealth gaps because those who produce a lot of wealth disproportionately benefit. The decline phase. When debts become very large, when the central banks lose their ability to stimulate debt and economic growth, and when there is an economic downturn, that leads to debt and economic problems and to more printing of money, which eventually devalues it. When wealth and values gaps get large and there is a lot of economic stress, wherever that stress comes from, there are high probabilities of greater conflict between the rich and the poor, at first gradually and then increasingly intensely. When the rich fear that their money will be taken away, they will be treated with hostility, that leads them to move their money and themselves to places, assets or currencies that they feel are safer. When these sorts of disruptive conditions exist, they undermine productivity, that shrinks the economic pie and causes more conflict about how to divide the shrinking resources well, which leads to even more internal conflict that increasingly leads to fighting between the populist leaders from both sides who want to take control to bring about order. When a country gains enough economic, geopolitical, and military power that it can challenge the existing dominant power, there are many areas of potential conflict between these rival world powers. When a leading country's costs of maintaining its empire abroad become greater than the revenue that the empire brings in, that economically weakens the country. When other exogenous shocks, such as acts of nature, for example, plagues, droughts, or floods, occur during times of vulnerability such as those mentioned above, they increase the risk of a self-reinforcing downward spiral. When the leadership of the country is too weak to provide what the country needs to be successful at its stage in the cycle, that is also a problem. Looked at even more simply, the items shown below are the main forces that drive the rises and declines of countries. For any country, the more items it has on the left, the more it is likely to ascend. The more items it has on the right, the more it is likely to decline. Where we are now. The last major period of destroying and restructuring happened in 1930 to 45, which led to a new global monetary system built in 1944 in Bretton Woods. It is now 75 years later, and we are classically near the end of a long-term debt cycle when there are large debts and classic monetary policies don't work well for the world's reserve currency central banks. All this is happening at the same time that there are big wealth and values gaps and there is a rising world power that is competing with the leading world power in trade, technology development, capital markets, and geopolitics. End of Chapter 1.